Thank you. Sir, ma'am, the stage is yours.
Can I request some of you to come in front? I mean, come. We don't bite. It's okay.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm happy to see students here and younger people because we're going to talk about something really fascinating, something that hopefully will give you more to think about and talk about and read about from our session. Um, this session is on the Indian Ocean, and Sanjeev has been collecting materials, sources, notes, and he's written a book called The Ocean of Churn. And since the Indian Ocean is what surrounds us, the subcontinent, and other countries around us, we will be talking about it. So, my first question to you, Sanjeev, is about the role of the Indian Ocean. And what importance and what role does it play to all the countries and region that it has outlined?
So let me thank Kalinga Literature Festival for inviting me, first of all, and for. As you can see, the session is about a history of the Indian Ocean. And of course, we are sitting here in Kathmandu, very far away from the ocean in the mountains. But people forget that the Himalayas are actually a heap of seabed that has been pushed into the sky as a result of the Indian plate pushing against the Asian plate. So in a sense, when you say that we are right now sitting at the bottom of the ocean, and this ocean has played a very important role in the way we think about world history. So unfortunately, the way except for a few countries like the UK, most of history of most countries, and this is particularly true of India, is written from a landlocked perspective. So maybe in the specific case of India, it is because our capital, Delhi, is landlocked. I don't know. But if you think about it, India is the only. So the Indian Ocean. So, when you think of Indian history, it is impossible to think about it without thinking about the interactions we have had with the rest of the world through maritime links. So just to give you some example, some of the earliest voyages in history of the world took place 5,000 years ago in the Bronze Age between ports in what is now Gujarat to Oman to Qatar to Bahrain to Sumeria, which is now Iraq, and all that area. And you actually have remains of a lot of Indian exports like Harappan seals and so on. But very importantly, there are records in Sumerian records of groups of Indians who they called the Meluhans, who came and lived in the Middle East. You go to Dubai today, you will see, lots of Indians. You'll see a lot of Nepalese as well. Don't think of this as a modern phenomena. This has been going on for a very, very long time. People have been migrating. They've been going and living. So we know there were enclaves of Meluhans, i.e. Indians, living in just outside of these Sumerian cities. And interestingly, just before we go, there is actually a record of a court case. Okay, so there's a court case in which there is a Meluhan, and remember these were all mostly from ports in Gujarat, so he's probably a Gujarati, and so he is sued by a local Sumerian for breaking his tooth in a drunken brawl, and the judge finds this Gujarati person culpable and asks compensation to the breaking of the tooth. So this is the first known mentioning of an Indian outside of India involved in this drunken brawl. And I have always speculated whether this is the origin of prohibition in Gujarat.
Well, yeah, I think that's really interesting. I just wanted to actually give the audience a sense of the time that you're talking about, the period. So how many years ago? Because you're a lot of
this
young
is
people here.
5,000 years ago, 4 to 5,000 years ago. So this is the Bronze Age. So you're talking about 2000 to 3000 BC. So this is a very, very long time. This is the period when
Yeah.
the pyramids are just about being built or have not been built. So, you're talking about a very, very early period. So there are ships flying back and forth and all over, and this is happening in the Indian Ocean at roughly the same time. The Egyptians, the Phoenicians, they are also exploring the oceans. They are the Minoans of. So this idea that we are landlocked as a species is not true. We are very much a maritime species, and we have been building ships from very, very early on.
Yeah, we'll come to that a little later. But I wanted to ask you why you wrote the book, because there are the books on Indian Ocean, and you bring, of course, your views and perspective into the book. So what was the driving force behind it?
So much of what is written about places like the Indian Ocean is written very often from perspectives of people who are not from the Indian Ocean. Maybe because of the colonial experience or whatever the reason may be. Much of what is written about the Indian Ocean is written by Europeans. Now, nothing wrong with Europeans writing about the Indian Ocean, but it is not our experience of the Indian Ocean, right? So very often what you have in books of is there'll be one starting chapter where you will have maybe a mention, yes, in ancient times. Really, it gets going by second chapter, you get to Vasco da Gama. Okay, so you have Vasco da Gama.
It's 1497.
1496 or something like that, 97. And he is a Portuguese sort of captain, and his ships, which come from Portugal, go around Africa, and they turn up in the Indian Ocean. And that's where the history of the Indian Ocean gets going, as if the rest of us were sitting around waiting for the Europeans to discover us. Now, this is completely crazy. So it is very important that we have a history that is written from our perspective. So when I began writing this book, you will notice Vasco da Gama turns up, in the second half of the book. So the first half is all about Indian merchants, Arab merchants, even the Chinese who come into the Indian Ocean and do all kinds of things.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because also I remember, you sort of talk about Vasco da Gama and, accidental discovery of America, and a lot of history like post that is what is focused on, and we study in great detail, but not so much, I think before that. So the book is revelatory in a lot of sense in those ways. So please get a copy, and you can get it signed by Sanjeev too. I also wanted to talk about a bit on the back and forth, because you have given a lot of stories and shared examples of how it was not only people from India, but a lot of people from Southeast Asia also coming into the subcontinent, and there was exchange of trade and other things. So what has how has that influenced? I think the coastline, and particularly, I think some places in South India that you talk about.
So not just South India, all of Indian history, and in fact, it will be even true of Nepal. Many, many things that you think are from this part of the world are actually from Southeast Asia or somewhere transported by oceanic voyages. I'll give you one example. Eating of pan and supadi, okay? Now, this is very common in India. Is it common in Nepal as well, eating pan supadi? Yeah, common. Now, it will come as some surprise to you that both the leaf and the nut, the supadi nut, are not Indian plants or Nepalese plants. They are actually from Southeast Asia. And the earliest examples of people eating this nutness thing come from places like Indonesia, Philippines, even in Taiwan. It's almost died out in Taiwan. There are some old people who still eat it. Yeah. But that is the zone from which this plant comes from. It does not come from here. And there is the earliest reference of an Indian sort of coming and sort of interacting with the pan is actually a very interesting story. We don't know the exact date, but I'll tell you the story. The story is that at some point, at that time, there was an Indian ship sailing along where is now Vietnam and Cambodia. So this is the Mekong Delta. And there, on board was the captain, who was a Brahmin called Kaundinya. So Kaundinya was on the ship, and they're sailing there, and they get attacked by pirates. So Kaundinya, being a brave sort, got his crew together. They fought off the pirates and they pushed them away. But then his ship developed all kinds of leaks. So he had no choice but to beach his ship and begin to fix it. So when he was fixing the ship, suddenly his ship gets and his crew gets surrounded by a local tribe, the Naga tribe, the serpent tribe. And they say that we're going to kill you. So now, you can imagine he's just a small ship with a small crew, and Kaundinya now is really scared, but form a shield wall or whatever, and they want to defend themselves. But it looks completely hopeless. But then life takes a sudden twist, and what happens is the chief of the tribe, the tribe, is a princess called Soma, the moon-faced one. And she sees Kaundinya, who is probably a handsome bloke, and falls in love with him. And so she proposes marriage. And I suppose Kaundinya didn't have too much choice in the matter at this stage. So he accepts this marriage, and they get married, and they set up the first Hindu kingdom in Southeast Asia, in what is southern Vietnam, Cambodia area, called the Kingdom of Funan. Now, where does this fit into our story? Is that the way she proposed marriage is also interesting. Yeah. The way, to this day, that region proposes a marriage a palm leaf and a supadi. And even today, it still continues, and in some communities in India, even today, this is done. For example, in northeast of India, it is done in this way. A pan and a supadi are sent as sort of a proposal for marriage.
They're quite integral. I think it's a ritual. I think even in East India, where I come from, Bihar, I think there are ceremonies where you use the betel nut. During. So
it is a Southeast Asian tradition that we have imbibed in India, and has spread all over, but it's not originally Indian.
Very interesting. We are in Nepal, but this is the Kalinga Festival, and I did want to ask you about the Bali Yatra that happens from Kalinga to Indonesia. So tell all of us more about it.
So Kalinga, for those who are not aware, is the ancient name for the modern state of Odisha. Yeah. So if you look on the map of India, you will see this is a state in eastern India. And from very early on, it had a tradition of sailing to all over. In fact, Kaundinya story I told may well have been from Odisha. We don't know where he came from, but that is the coastline he came from. Now, to this day, there is a festival which happens in Kartik Purnima. Is Kartik Purnima celebrated at all in Nepal? Yes, there is a Kartik Purnima. So in Kartik Purnima, there are various different kinds of celebrations in various Hindu communities, but the celebration that is done in Odisha is very unique. What happens is, on the morning of Kartik Purnima, what happens is that the families get together before sunrise, and then they go to a water body. It could be a river, it could be a lake, it could be the sea. And they take a small paper boat, or it could be made from the insides of a banana, in water with a lamp. Now, this festival has been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So the question is, why are they doing this? Yeah. The reason
how did it start?
So what is going on here is, actually they are reenacting the fact that at this time of the year, the merchant fleets from Kalinga used to go off to Indonesia. And why do they do it this time of the year? Remember, Kartik Purnima happens somewhat in the middle of November. Yeah. So in the middle of November, what happened is the wind switch, and they begin to blow from the north. So now you can catch the wind and go southwards, because during this season where we are now, you cannot sail southwards. You have to sail northward because the winds are blowing south to north. But in November, they switched to north to south. So they would catch the wind and they would sail out towards, guess where? Indonesia. And particularly to the island of Bali, which even today, some of you may know, is an island in Bali. So this voyage is remembered in the festival, that in an affair that happens to this day in Odisha called Bali Yatra. Now, it literally means the voyage to Bali or the journey to Bali. So it is very interesting that although this tradition of these merchant fleets no longer use the wind, and that tradition is no longer alive, but every year we remember this by virtue of putting these boats in the water as a commemoration when the Shadhoba merchants would set sail from Odisha and head out. So what effectively is doing is that the family is turning up at the seashore and saying goodbye to their menfolk who are setting sail for going off to Indonesia. So that is what we are commemorating. So before I end, let me say there is a parallel festival even around about the same time also in Thailand, which is...
Oh, very interesting. So
Yes.
both sides, right?
Yes, so in
Both
Thailand
oceans.
also, because remember what is happening. So Thailand is also monsoonic. So almost identical festival happens in Thailand where they put these boats in the water with lamps at about the same time. I forget the name of it. But this festival is commemorated to this day. Interestingly, till relatively few decades ago, people had forgotten the cultural significance of it. And it has been rediscovered both in Thailand and in India about why this festival is done in this particular way. I'm sure some scholars knew, but generally speaking, people had stopped remembering why they did this festival. But today, I think the maritime linkages to it are much better understood.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating to see that, some of these traditions and rituals are practiced on both sides of the ocean, and how they came about, right? There was this cultural exchange. One of the stories in the book that you talk about, which I personally found really fascinating, was heir to the Pallava dynasty,
Yes.
So that I think is a really fascinating example of how politically too, we are connected.
Absolutely. So this is in the 9th century, so about 1200 years ago. What happens is, the Pallavas, by the way, for those who are unaware, are one of the big, great dynasties of southern India. So what is now Tamil Nadu and the surrounding area was once ruled by this dynasty called the Pallavas. And they were in constant conflict with another dynasty called the Chalukyas, who are in what is now Karnataka, Maharashtra area. Now what happens is, this dynasty lasted a long time, but in the early 9th century, suddenly the king died, and he died without an heir. So now there was panic in the Pallava Empire, because now the Chalukyas were almost certainly turn up and conquer their kingdom. So a big council was held in their capital in Kanchipuram. So if you go to Chennai, it's only 30 kilometers or 40 kilometers outside of Chennai. So it's almost a suburb in Kanchipuram. And in Kanchipuram, they held a big council. And in that council, some old scholar, priest, whatever, stood up, and he says that, there is another branch of the Pallavas, that more than 100 years ago, the younger king of the then Pallava king, a prince called Bhima, had gone away across the ocean and married a local princess on the other side of the ocean. And perhaps there are some descendants of this prince, so he would also be a Pallava. So why don't we get him to come back? So what they do is they create a small delegation. They go to Mahabalipuram. Mahabalipuram, by the way, was the main capital, the main port of the Pallavas. So they get into their ships, they sail across. We don't know exactly where, so it could have been to what is now Malaysia, or it could have been to Cambodia or to southern Vietnam. All of these were Indianized Hindu kingdoms with whom the Pallavas had links. So we don't know exactly where. But anyway, this delegation turns up on the other side of the ocean, and they go to this kingdom, and they find the descendant of Bhim, and he has 4 sons. So he says, will you give us one of the 4 sons to come back to the original homeland and take over the kingdom? So they said, okay, why don't, so the prince says, okay, ask my sons. So there are 4 sons. So they ask each of the sons one in turn. And what happens is the first elder 3 sons say no. It's a dangerous journey. Who knows where, far off land, who knows, we don't even know who you are. One who is only 11 years old, he agrees. So this delegation takes this young boy of 11 years old, brings him back to Mahabalipuram, and from where he's taken to Kanchipuram. But then Kanchipuram, meanwhile, has been captured by another candidate supported by the Chalukyas. So they scatter him, hide him away somewhere else, and they crown him as Nandi Varman II. And this young boy, this Cambodian prince, Nandi Varman II, then goes on to reconquer his kingdom back and become one of the greatest kings of southern India. And the reason we know this story is very interesting is that if you go to Kanchipuram, which was the Pallava capital, there is a temple that he built. And on the walls of that temple, he not only inscribed the story of how he had come about, he also created panels of sculptures to show and sort of. So if you go and look at that illustration, is very interesting. The early pieces of the panels, you will see that the people involved. So for example, where the delegation goes to his father's court and asks for him and all of that. If you look at them, they clearly don't look Indian. They look Cambodian. They look Oriental. And you can clearly see the influence of Cambodian art on it. So, so this person who looked Oriental, because they've been there for hundreds of years, must have intermarried locally. So Nandi Varman II, one of the greatest kings of southern India, would essentially have looked, was a Cambodian prince, and he would have basically looked like a Southeast Asian.
Yeah, no, this is a really fascinating story. And more so because, I've been to the Perumal temple that you talk about the inscriptions. So I sort of course, know exactly what you're talking about. Land. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about warfare and move on from politics to warfare, because you have spoken about the Indian mercenaries and soldiers, who also sort of traveled to faraway lands, and they have contributed in various events. So tell us a bit more and some stories around that.
So, a myth is spread around that Indians for some reason did not go and conquer or fight outside of the Indian subcontinent. This is actually not true. There are large numbers of evidence of Indians, Indian tribes going outside the boundaries of the Indian subcontinent, setting up kingdoms outside. I mentioned one with the case of Bhima. I mentioned one with Kaundinya. There were also military expeditions to Central Asia. For example, the area that we now, the area of Kashgar, that is actually Kashi, and in Indian text is known as Uttar Kuru. And for Indians living there, interacting with people from Central Asia, and with a very Sanskritized culture. So this entire Himalayan region has had lots of people going outside, Indians going out, others coming in. Similarly, there are examples of Indians going off, and like the Mitanni turning up in the Bronze Age in the Middle East. And so there's a Middle East
Bronze Age, right?
Bronze Age. So when I was talking about 4,000 years ago, this is 1,300 BC, and they worshipped Indra and Varuna. And by the way, interestingly, you may know of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. She was Mitanni, and consequently of Indian origin. So there is a lot of this kinds of lot of ancient things. There is similarly in later medieval period, you have lots of Indian mercenaries. So, the Nepalese have a tradition of mercenary tradition of soldiers fighting for different countries, particularly the British, but others as well. But the Indian, generally the subcontinent has had this tradition for a long time. So for example, in the Battle of Karbala, right, you know that's the schism between the Sunnis and the Shias happen. And the descendants of Prophet Muhammad are killed by the Sunni faction. That's how that schism happens. What is less remembered is that the personal bodyguards of the Prophet's descendants were Punjabi Brahmins, the Mohial Brahmins. Okay, they still have surnames like Dutt and so on from Punjab, and even to this day, when you have the mourning of the Karbala happens, they also participate in it.
During Muharram.
During Muharram, they also participated in it because the personal bodyguard, in fact, of Hussein and Hassan also died in that battle. Similarly, you have Indian metal workers who in the medieval period went to, so India was, by the way, from very ancient times, famous for its metallurgy. And what you know as the Damascus sword is made with this wood steel, which is an Indian technology. So the Arabs and later on the Ottoman Turks, etc., imported Indian metal workers to go to the Middle East to make weapons to fight against the Crusaders. So the weapons being used by the Islamic side against the Crusaders were basically made by Indian metal workers. And because they were so important to the culture there, they were allowed to largely remain separate groups. So they were not forcibly integrated into, so they retained some part of their. Ottoman Turks invaded Europe. They took these Indian metal workers with them into Europe. And from there, they spread all over Europe. And we today know them as the Gypsy. So the Gypsies are the descendants of Indian metal workers who were taken during the Crusades and then further taken into Europe by the Ottomans. And we now know them as the Gypsies or the Roma and so on. And now we know from genetic tests, etc., that they actually come from the Rajasthan area.
No, this is fascinating, and there are many such stories in the book. So I do urge all of you to get your copy and read more. I definitely was fascinated. I have one last question, and after that, we will see the presentation that you have on the ship. That
if you can set up my presentation, can you ask where my presentation is? Do you have that? Yeah, do you have my presentation? Okay. If you can set it up while we have the last
I have
question.
one last question. About the future, and you referred to Robert Kaplan's book, Monsoon, and you said in the book that the politics of the 21st century will be determined what happens in and around the Indian Ocean. So why do you say that?
So you have to see where all the resources and the people and so on is. If you'll just have to look at a map. India is obviously in the middle of the Indian Ocean. That doesn't require great knowledge. But look at where are all the other players. Australia is often thought of as a Pacific country, but in fact, it is also an Indian Ocean country. You have the entire Middle East, which is also a part of this story. You have countries like Singapore and Indonesia are a part of this, but the whole of Africa is also linked to this. So there is a huge amount of linkages that the Indian Ocean has had, which, by the way, has always been the case. But for the Atlantic and then more recently the Pacific became kind of the center of the world. The Indian Ocean was for most of human history the center of geopolitics, economic exchange, cultural exchange, and so on. It literally goes back to the beginning of time. In fact, the human species was born in East Africa on the shores of the Indian Ocean. So we are an Indian Ocean species. This is where we spread from. Much of our linkages, growth, expansion, all of it happened in this area. And except for these 2 centuries that I mentioned, most of world history is around the Indian Ocean. In some ways, it is coming back to it. You already hear the term Indo-Pacific, so you can see the drift from the Pacific out, expanding that zone. Obviously, India is now in the next few years going to become the world's third largest economy in its own right. But Indonesia is huge quickly, and as I said, there are many other countries in that zone which are becoming important. Even the trade between, say, Europe and China goes through this region. It has to eventually go right past India into the Red Sea, out of the Suez. So this area is very, very important throughout history, and we can clearly see that its importance is coming back very rapidly.
And this is fascinating, but what is even more so is what you're doing. Currently, Sanjeev is building a ship. It's a staged ship, if I'm correct, based on knowledge and techniques that are 1500 years old, and which he plans to use it for sailing on the ancient routes from Kerala to Indonesia and elsewhere. So let's see more about it and hear more about
so
it.
Let me tell you a little bit about it. I'm going to present this. I've got the thing. Yeah. So, all right, or you can just flip the. Why don't you? Can you show the slide on the screen, please? You did not get the presentation. Lene gaye. Oh, that is going to take some time. See, somewhere I can WhatsApp it to right now. I'll be faster. No. They've gone to get it. It is not loaded. Net slow se kya hoga? It should have been loaded anyway.
I have it on my phone too.
Can you do it from the phone? Can I do it from?
Project it from.
Yeah. Is there some way I can project it from directly from my phone? I also have it. Yeah, can you make sure the slide show is there? It's not loaded in anybody's laptop? Is there in your laptop? Yeah, so do it from there. Okay, while they sort out this thing, let me tell you a little bit about it. So basically, all these voyages I talked about, they were done in these ships that the Indians designed, which were very peculiar design. So although Indians knew how to make rust-free nails, you need rust-free nails to build ships for the ocean. And Indians knew how to make these rust-free nails. Oddly enough, they did not use these rust-free nails to make most of their ships. What they would do is they would take the planks and they would stitch it together. And this technique of stitching it together was used maybe from very ancient times. We don't know how ancient, maybe even during the Bronze Age voyages, maybe that's what they were doing. But certainly we have very good records of the 5th, 6th century BC onwards. So I decided that why don't we try to build a ship using this ancient design and try and sail it and see what happens. So a few years ago, I began to research this and I discovered these ancient texts called the Yukti Kalpataru, where some description is there of how the ships looked and what kind of things were done. And then I found some paintings in a place called Ajanta. There are paintings, there are some sculptures of these ancient, and basically you can see that you can see the stitching on the sculptures or in the case of the paintings. So I said, this is fantastic, but does anyone know how to make these kind of ships? So I began to look for people who may remember how this technique was done. And I was absolutely amazed that there was still a very tiny number of people along the coast who had remembered. They were traditional shipwrights who had been building these ships for thousands of years, remembered some of this technique. Now, they weren't building big ships because obviously now we build modern ships using steel and fiberglass and all this kind of thing. But what they were doing was they were building small boats, maybe, small fishing boats, maybe the size of this stage and so on, using this technique. Now, obviously, we can't just take that technique and expand it. once you build a big ocean-going ship as opposed to a coastal fishing boat, the dynamics completely changes. Nevertheless, what I did is I got hold of these people and began to document what they did. And then I collected some of them and began to design a ship which would have been like one of the ships which was sailing 2000 years ago, 1500 years ago, and so on. And ultimately, I put together a design of what is a reasonable replica of what one of these ships would be. And then I managed to convince first and then our culture ministry, and then ultimately also our Navy. And together we have now got a project to actually build a ship of that design and then try and sail it on the Indian Ocean. So now what I'm going to do in this presentation is to show you firstly what does the ship look like and how this construction is being done. And let me tell you, some part of it is from the texts, some part of it is traditional knowledge, which I told you has sort of been remembered by these people. Some part of it is from the paintings, and some part of it we have just invented.
Okay,
Yeah.
can you please project the slide
Yeah, project it on the slide.
Okay.
Okay, so if you move to the next slide, please. So this is about the historical perspective, the aim of the project, earlier constructions, understanding stitch ships, reconstruction, and future course. This is how the slides are. Next slide. Depictions of ancient Indian ships. This is from I chose this one from the Bhog Mandap of the Jagannath Puri temple. This is after all the Kalinga festival. And if you see, you can see these planks are stitched together. These are not nailed together. Can you see the stitching on the sides? And you can also see that from the Babar Nama, this is a Mughal text. And you can again see the planks are sort of stitched together. Now, next, please. And then there are descriptions of these texts, these kinds of ships in these ancient texts. So one of them is Raja Bhoj, who was a famous Indian king from the 9th century, central India. And he wrote a book called the Yukti Kalpataru, which has a significant section on shipbuilding. And he tells us how big these ships were. So some were ordinary ships, so Samanya, and there were specialized ships called Vishesha. And we get the proportions of some of these ships. They're not small. Huh? So, and you can see the length in cubit. And the very biggest ships called the Begini were 176 cubits long. That's almost like 100 meters long. Breadth of 22 meters and so on. So these are very thin, narrow, long ships. We don't know about how they were kept stable because modern design would suggest that these are way too narrow and long. But anyway, these are the kinds of things. And we also know that they used to have cabins. So, passengers, merchants, etc. and so on. So it's very interesting. Next. And we also have descriptions from foreign travelers. So you have Ptolemy, who tells us that Indian shipbuilders would build fleets of up to 2,000 ships. And some of them were capable of accommodating 1,000 troops, horses, vast numbers of supplies. You have Marco Polo, who tells us of Indian ships with crew was 150 people, with oars and nails, but with iron nails. I'm telling you this so that you know that it's not because the Indians didn't know how to make nailed ships. They did, and they did
And
build them
iron
sometimes.
also.
Huh?
Used iron.
And then iron nails. But for some reason, they used to stitch them together as well. Niccolo Conti, 1400s, is before Vasco da Gama, talks about a ship with 1,000 tons, 5 sails. You have Santo Stefano, again before Vasco da Gama, talks timbers of the ships were stitched together with cords and so on. Next. So here is a 5th century ship painting from Ajanta, and you can again see ship. It's an artistic depiction, so you have to take it with a pinch of salt. But you can see 3 masts, the ship is there. You can see one of the sailors standing there. You can see the vats of water. That's how the pots of water they used to use. These are the kinds of ships being used 1,500 years ago. Next. So when I was looking for whether or not you can find people who are doing this kind of tiny groups of people along the coast who were still stitching them together. And these are the kinds of small boats that were building with this stitching technique. You can see it's quite crude. You simply couldn't use this simply to expand it out to a big ocean-going ship. This is just for coastal work. But nevertheless, what it did mean is that some of these people still remembered this technique. It was also interesting because when I began researching I found people who remembered some of the ratios of bigger ships, even though they had never built these ships. They had these rhymes and ratios which they had
through oral
inherited.
traditions, like
Yeah,
they know this.
they are just oral tradition. Next. So we began to put it together, and so we decided, before everything is forgotten, let us try and build an ancient ship. It would be a good way to revive this tradition and give a sense of pride in the Indian maritime heritage. Next. So we are not the only people who have ever done this. There are other parts of the world who have also done recreations like that was done in 2008, 2009, and others as well. So, Omanis have a very rich tradition of sailing ships. And so others have also done recreations. There are other recreations in other parts of the world, like Viking ships have been done and so on. So that's as well. Next. So what do you do? How do you stitch this thing together? So you take the planks and you put them together with coir ropes, needles obviously for stitching, and basically you take these long planks and you put these holes, and then you take these coir ropes. They are not like any old coir ropes, but they are specially made coir ropes. And then you use something called resin called kudrus to fill in the gaps between the planks. And then you have to use fish oil and so on to make it. Next. So this is how the frame was first set up. This ship is being constructed as we speak in a shipyard in Goa. This is how the first frame is created. You can see the first, and that's how you start. Next. And you can see the way the planks have to be curved, right? So how do you curve the planks? The way it is done is that you put it in these steaming chambers inside and you steam it. You steam it for several hours, so the fibers of the wood become soft. And then when you pull it out, you have just about got 2 minutes before the thing hardens again. So you have to very, very quickly shape it, and you can see the shaping is done. And it has to be done very precisely. Now remember, this is being done by traditional artisans who don't have any of the measuring tapes, and they are done purely by eye and sense. So they are doing it, and you can see they have done these planks. Next. So this is how it is done again. Next. Next. Yeah. And then you can see the stitching is done. You can see the stitch on the last one. The strands of coir are put together, and they put wadding, and then they stitch it. That wadding is important because it creates, first of all, some waterproofing, but it also provides some give to the roping. Next. And this is how the stitching is done. Again, some idea of how the stitching is done. Next. And once some of the stitching is done, you begin to put in a frame internally. See, what is interesting about this is there's no internal frame. So the hull is actually quite flexible. But then you have to still give it some frame. So after the hull is built, you insert the frame in. This is important because in modern ships or any other kinds of ships, you typically build a frame and you nail it together. Here, the opposite is done. You actually build the hull and then you put the frame in. Next. This is some of the work being done. You then have the coating with the fish oil on the inside and the hull. As you can, and I have been assured that it will slowly fade away. Otherwise, sailing in a ship that smells of fish oil all the time may not be very pleasant. Next. So, next. This is how we have put it together. The Ministry of Culture has provided the funding. The Indian Navy is providing the crew, and of course the Ministry of Culture and Shipping are providing support because these will be voyages that we will be doing. Next. So here is what we took the Ajanta painting. This is the schematic drawing of the same ship so that you get a thing. And now we converted that into proper line drawings. Next. So this is how the line drawings of the actual ship will be, the ship that we are going to attempt to build. You can see there are 2 masts. There is also a foresail. And this is what it looked like. And if you look at the proportions, it's about 21 meters long. Next. So it's not hugely long. The length here has actually been expanded recently. The reason I'm giving you all of this is so that you get a sense of how big it is. It's not massive, but it is not small either. 21 meters is the size of this hall. So it's a reasonably large sized ship by the standards of ancient India. Next. It'll have a crew of about 15. So some more of the line development plans. Next. This is how the rigging will be done with 2 masts and foresail. Next. Some more. And one important thing, you can see that these are square sails. You see, today if you see modern ships, they have triangular sails. Those are called lantern sails. They have the advantage of being able to sail at an angle to the wind. But at that time, that had not been invented yet. So they used to use square sails, which are efficient, but only if you sail with the wind. You cannot sail at too much of an angle to the wind. A little bit, but not too much. Next. This is a scaled down model, 1:10 scaled down model of the we are using to test it in a towing tank. So do all the testing. Next. Remember, nobody has sailed in these kind of ships for centuries. So we have to be sure that when we put it in the water, it doesn't just sink. So we are also asking for advice from the Omanis who had built a reconstructed ship from a slightly later period. But nevertheless, they have some experience. They had used some of the shipwrights from India to build their ships. So we have used some of those same shipwrights. A gentleman called Babu Sankaran, who is helping us with this as well. So you can see this is an IIT Madras where we are doing these testings of this. I have excluded all the technical details. Actually, this presentation is very often, I do it to naval architecture schools. So they tend to have a lot of technical details, which I have gotten rid of. Next. And you can see the thing. You can click on one of the photographs. Actually, this is a video. Can you click on one of the photographs? Yeah, just click on it. No, click on the photograph. If you click on it, it's a video.
Click on top of the picture.
Click on top of the picture. The video will play. It's not. No. It doesn't play. Okay, never mind. Never mind. We go to the next. This is the next slide. These are the kind of other things you have to also think about. For example, we are not using modern anything in it, right? So other than some safety equipment, we will not be including too many modern things. We will probably have some electric lights, etc. But basically, if you go back to the previous slide, please, I want to show that. Yeah. What is this? These are actually ancient anchors. This lot of anchors, the triangular one over there, is actually pulled out from Dwarka. And it is a Harappan era anchor. So this anchor is perhaps 4,000 years old. And
Still survived.
It has survived. Except in the triangle, the circle at the bottom here is where the rope would be to pulling it in and out, right? But the other 2 holes are very important. They would have wooden spikes going across. Both of them. So you would have these 2 wooden spikes going across. So when you put it in the water, it then locks into like a modern, if you see a modern anchor, they have these 2 things at the sides. This had the same thing, except there were 2 of them, wooden spikes on either side. And this is what would get locked in rock or the sea bottom and so on. And you can see other designs as well were used. So for example, this is a later anchor. This also, as you can see, has this hole for lifting. This hole is for the rope. And then there would be a spike going through like that, wooden spike, which would provide the hooking experience. You can see the middle one has sort of given somebody's attempted to do it, but that's in order to provide the hook. Next. So these are some photographs which I have taken from, as I told you, the Jewel of Muscat. This is not the ship. We haven't put our ship in the water yet. But just to give you a sense of what we would do. So the ship is now about 60% done. We are hoping that by February, March of next year, the ship will be put into the ocean just like this. You can see when it's put in the ocean initially it doesn't have masts and all these kinds of things. Once it's in the water, you begin to put all the other stuff. Next. And these are all photographs from Jewel of Muscat, but so that you get a sense, we will put our masts and other things. Next. And then we will have to do sea trials. Because remember, we don't know how these things sail. The ship, as you saw, does not have a rudder. It's got a trailing oar. It has square sails. It has a stitched hull, which is flexible, which means that if you go into a big storm. So not only do each individual piece of this cause all kinds of things we don't know, the combination of this is also not very known. So we will really have to rely on learning how to do it, and also from experience from the Jewel of Muscat, which also had, it's from a later period, but had some of these features. Next. So what will we do with this ship? So once we have figured out how to sail it, the idea is first to take it on a slightly shorter route. For its first voyage, we are hoping to take it from Gujarat area and sail it to the Persian Gulf. We will go to Muscat and maybe go further in as well. So that is going to be our first voyage, hopefully by December of 2025, around about that time. Assuming that that voyage comes out well, and that voyage has, by the way, already been announced by Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi and His Highness the Sultan of Oman. So they have already done, which will be about a 2-3 week crossing depending on the wind. We will then attempt even more ambitious one.
Longer route.
This is a longer route, which relates to this festival, because this is the route I told you about, the Kalinga. This is the Kalinga festival, but in ancient Kalinga, as I told you, they used to do these voyages. And so we will attempt to actually do the Bali Jatra. And so if you look at this slide here, it also tells you the routes that we can use. So as I told you, in Kartik Purnima, the wind blows from the north. So what would happen is these ancient Odia merchants, they call the Shadobas, would set sail. This is from Odisha area. They would, this entire coastline from Bengal, Odisha to this entire Andhra, even here, this entire coastline is very maritime. They would set sail and they would go. Now remember, they can't sail at an angle to the wind because of squares across. They couldn't. The winds are blowing like this. So they would sail along the wind and go to Mahabalipuram. I told you about Mahabalipuram, the big port. Or there's another port from a slightly later area called Nagapatnam. There's the Chola era. So the Pallava era, it would be Mahabalipuram, Chola era, Nagapatnam. Then from there, they would go further south to Sri Lanka. And then they would go a little further south and then use the current to cross. So this crossing is not done with the wind, but with a current. There's a cross equatorial current. And they would end up somewhere in northern Sumatra. Now they had a choice. They could either go outside and go all the way to Bali, which is here, or they could go inside through the Malacca Straits, go past Singapore, and also sail there. So there is a choice. We'll see what we do. And depends on the winds and other things. The inside route has the advantage that you can go past Singapore and Malaysia and visit more countries. It has the disadvantage that it's full of boat runs the risk of being whacked around by the wake of, large
the modern
ships going past us, and we'll probably get bounced around quite a lot by that. But anyway, this is something that we will have to work out. So this is what is being attempted next. So this is what the ship construction was about a month ago. So it has progressed from here, but you can see how the construction is coming together. So I hope you got a sense of this project. Next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. I think there's a lot of action in 2025. So we will eagerly wait for what happens next. And I wish you all the best for putting your ship in water and also for the trials and the voyages. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful session and presentation. And now we have token of love for Sanjeev, sir. And to do the honor, I would like to invite Ms. Ranjana, ma'am, Now, moving onward, we have an inspiration conversation on breaking boundaries, gender narratives, and celebrating women's contribution to literature and society. So, for this, we have our esteemed guest speakers, Ms. Lakshmi Murdeshwar Puri and Ms. Bandana Rana.